One of the main basic economic models is the circular flow model, which describes the movement of money and products through the economy in a very simplified way. The model represents all the actors in an economy as either households or companies. In other words, the model describes a pure market economy with no government intervention. In addition, the model divides markets into two categories: markets for goods and services, and markets for factors of production, or factor markets. Goods and services markets are probably usually what come to mind when we think about markets. In the market for goods and services, we have firms as the seller of goods and services, and we have households as the buyers of goods and services. And we can think about how the money and the products flow between households and firms. For example, the firms are selling things through the goods and services market to the consumer. So if we're going to think about the flow of stuff, the arrows are going to go like this. They're going to go from the firms to the market, and then from the market to the household. On the other hand, because we're always exchanging money for stuff, or goods and services in an economic sense, we're going to have the money going from households into the market, because the households are buying stuff and giving up money. And we're going to have money going to the firms, because they're getting money in exchange for selling their output. If the goods and services markets were the only markets in an economy, economic activity would eventually stop, because you would notice that all the money would eventually go to the sellers in the market, or the companies, and all the stuff would eventually go to the households, or the buyers in this market, and there would be no more room for exchange. Luckily, the flip side of this is we also have what are called factor markets, or markets for the factors of production. Before we talk about the markets for the factors of production, it's important to understand what factors of production are. Simply put, factors of production are anything that goes into the production process. So, for example, factors of production would be labor. It could also be capital or machines used to make stuff. They could be land and other natural resources, again, necessary inputs to the production process. In the markets for factors of production, the roles of firms and households are reversed compared to what we saw in the markets for goods and services. Namely, in factor markets, the firms are the demanders or the buyers of the factors of production, and households are the sellers or the suppliers of factors of production, such as labor, land, capital, etc. So if we were to think about the flow of factors of production and the flow of money on this side of our circular flow, it would look as follows. Again, because we have the households supplying the factors of production, we have labor, land, and capital going from the household to the market. Let's call that labor, capital, land, etc. And then we have the firms on the receiving end of these factors of production. So we can put labor, land, and capital going like this as well. On the other hand, because we're always exchanging money for stuff, we can think about the dollars flowing in this general direction, because the households are receiving money in exchange for giving up their factors of production. So we have the dollars flowing from the firms or companies, and we have the dollars flowing to the households in the factor markets. It's sometimes a little counterintuitive to think about households being the suppliers of the factors of production, so it's worth taking a second to think about what that really means. A household supplying labor is pretty straightforward. Essentially, a firm is renting a person as an employee when they choose to supply their services to that company. Supplying land is also pretty straightforward, but what does it really mean to supply capital to a firm? We can think about capital as literally the machines that make stuff, but in this context, what the households are really doing is supplying financial capital in the form of investments that the company can use to actually buy those machines. So it's not necessarily the case that the households are literally supplying the firms with machines, but instead they're lending or investing in the company so that the company can buy the machines itself. If we looked at the markets for factors of production in isolation, we would notice that if these are the only types of markets, again, economic activity would eventually cease because all the households would have all the money and all the firms would have all of the factors of production. Luckily, when we put the two types of markets together, we get a closed loop where we see the dollars keep going around and around like so that we can sustain economic activity over time rather than having all the money end up with either the firms or the households. Like we said earlier, the basic version of the circular flow diagram describes a pure market economy with no government intervention. As you can see here, we have a number of options for if we wanted to extend this model where we could insert government intervention or taxes, etc., into this process. For example, we could think about income taxes, we could think about taxes on consumption, etc., and in each of those cases, we would have our government intervention modeled as coming in at a different part of the process. The circular flow model is pretty simple and hopefully easy to understand, but it's super important to be clear on the interactions between all the entities and markets that we see here, because it's the circular flow diagram that then informs the setup of the supply and demand models that we'll see shortly. Whether it be a supply and demand diagram for the markets for goods and services, in which case the firms are the suppliers and the households are the demanders, or a supply and demand model for a market for factors of production, in which case the firms are the buyers or demanders and the households are the sellers.